The two-party system of the United States has often been the subject of great criticism by both American citizens and those abroad. These critiques tend to break down along four main points. One is the issue of polarization, the claim that if only two parties exist, they're likely to adopt policies existing on opposite sides of the spectrum, making compromise far more difficult and national progress toward either party's goals impossible, as each changing administration would then work to undo the achievements of the prior. Second, and in contrast to the first critique, is that a two-party system creates an illusion of choice, that the two parties at the end of the day are basically the same, that meaning in the modern sense that both Republicans and Democrat politicians are just self-interested globalists in the pockets of major corporations and elite groups. Mind you, this is something held by both people on the right and left, both of whom have historically attempted to remedy this by supporting third parties or non-establishment candidates like Donald Trump in the case of conservatives or Bernie Sanders in the case of the left wing, and we often find active roadblocks put in place by the establishment to prevent the non-establishment faction from competing on equal footing. Thirdly, there is the matter that with only two parties, both sides are attempting to maximize their total voter appeal, and as such widen their platform to be more inclusive of niche demographics or interest groups, and in doing so no longer specialize or focus on major or even controversial issues. Controversial issues especially being swept under the rug until they become far too large to ignore. This feeds into the prior point of the establishment Democrats and Republicans gradually adopting similar platforms in order to attempt to steal voters away from the other side. Fourth, and perhaps harkening back to the first criticism, is that in a polarized two-party winner-take-all system, you can have a situation in which 51% of the population tramples over the rights of the remaining 49. But now we're uncovering a secondary aspect that goes beyond having more than two parties. Sure, you can have a large third and fourth party which breaks the national vote roughly into quarters. But under normal circumstances, and assuming representation is our prime concern here, this could be even worse, as you now have just over 25% of the population deciding who becomes president for the whole country. In the UK and some of its former colonies, such as Canada, we see the use of the first-past-the-post system, where the party which wins not necessarily a majority of parliamentary seats but a plurality of said seats is deemed the winner, and their leader assumes, in the case of the UK, the title of Prime Minister. Mind you, this is a system used primarily in parliamentary governments, and though it could be translated to fit the United States, it doesn't achieve a very different result, not to mention it would likely demand a restructuring of how the president is elected, which could become a constitutional issue all on its own. These election systems offer a little bit more variety in terms of larger secondary parties, but generally there's really only two main choices who receive the bulk of votes, while the rest remain minor factions who at best win local elections, but not national elections. Thus, merely having larger alternative parties does not remedy desires for more representation. What might be opted for instead is the substitution of the plurality or majority system for a proportional representation system. This is a system in which a party receiving perhaps only 5% of the votes still receives some representation in government instead of losing outright. In a system where representation can be achieved by even small niche demographics or specific interest groups, there's automatically a great incentive to create your own political faction to specifically represent you and your group, instead of being a small voice in a catch-all Big Tent party. But exactly what groups in the United States are most likely to form their own political parties? How much power would they hold, and just what would the system mean for the US if it were implemented? Before going any further, let's take a minute to thank today's generous sponsor, Ridge Wallet. Folks, if you're carrying cash and cards around, odds are you're going to need a wallet to keep them nice and tidy, and no wallet does that better than Ridge Wallet, taking up barely half the size of a leather wallet without compromising your carrying capacity. Made out of durable, high-quality materials, Ridge is a wallet that'll last you a lifetime. And if it doesn't, let Ridge know and they'll replace it absolutely free, because every one of their wallets is backed by a lifetime guarantee. Head over to ridge.com/MonsieurZ and use promo code MonsieurZ at checkout to get 10% off your order and free worldwide shipping and returns. And remember, if you're not fully satisfied with your wallet, you can return it within 45 days for a full refund. Now, back to the video. As a large country, the United States has understandably come to develop several distinct cultural identities over the past 2 centuries. Regional differences began to emerge early on, with a predominantly English North and a Scottish, Irish, and Scotch-Irish population in the South, each with their own lifestyles, politics, and economies. In New England, it meant trade with Europe. In the Middle States, it meant production of man-made goods. In the South, it meant agriculture. The Southerners needed more land to farm and took to expansionism early on. To put simply, a complex situation, this meant the expansion of slavery to more states and an increase in the political power of the pro-slavery lobby, which the non-agrarian and non-slave-holding North opposed. And so the North also pushed westward to balance out national power. As the country expanded further, so were French elements incorporated into the population, though relatively small they might have been. Germans who had existed in small number previously saw a population boom in early 1800, quickly growing from the hub of Pennsylvania to occupy a majority of the Great Lakes region. These middle states would go on to become the great industrial heart of the country, one which now challenged Southern political power. Cultural, political, and religious differences between the North and South would finally erupt in civil war come 1861, a war which ultimately saw the previously enslaved black population freed and in some parts left in control of the local governments until the white Southerners regained power toward the end of the Reconstruction era. It would be in the mid to late 1800s as well that the Catholic Irish began arriving in large number and settled in the mid-Atlantic region along with some Italians and Eastern Europeans. In that time, the Germans had spread across the Northwest and were gearing up to become a national majority in a matter of years. Having brought and retained their language, customs, and traditions, it appeared as though America's future would be German. But just then, the Great War broke out. Anti-German sentiment soared, and the Germans were aggressively integrated into the dominant Anglo-American culture. Hispanics, mostly from Mexico and other parts of Central America who had previously arrived in small number and never constituted more than 2% of the population, finally saw a major rise in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s following the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, going from 3% of the population at that point to nearly 17% of the population today. All of these historic migrations and the deeper history behind them has left the United States with a menagerie of distinct religions, ethnicities, lifestyles, and cultures, all with their own visions and opinions on how their communities and the country as a whole should be run. Meaning any number of these groups alone are quite capable of and inclined to establish their own political parties, whose platforms would emphasize their particular needs and interests. Some of these factions will be quite large and contend for power at the national level, while others with only minor support will be relegated to local or state offices or dissolve entirely if they're unable to retain a minimum 1% of the electorate. Before addressing the many identity-driven parties likely to form, let's first cover the ideological fragmentation of the Democrat and Republican parties and the factions that would emerge from them. Beginning with the Republicans, we find a broad coalition of conservatism that ranges from the traditional conservatives who believe in natural law and hierarchical social order, to the socially liberal interventionist neoconservatives whose sole conservative position may lie in economics or on matters of religion. We can simplify this wide spectrum of conservatism into three main factions. Traditional conservatives, nationalists, and social conservatives would be grouped together into one large nationalist or simply conservative party. It would stand on the traditional America First principles of self-reliance and isolation, advocate policies of economic protectionism, and protect traditional American values. Libertarians, populists, and business Republicans would come together to form a constitutionalist party, one which would stand on policies of individual freedom, deregulation, limited government, and non-interventionism. Moderates and some neoconservative elements would be the remnants of the official Republican Party, which would exist politically somewhere between the conservatives and constitutionalists. Their policies would reflect moderate conservatism, free trade, and responsible intervention to protect allies and democracies. On the Democrat side, we find perhaps an even wider coalition of left-wingers ranging from centrists to socialists, with several non-ideological subgroups. Part of the reason for this is that the Democrats sell themselves as a party of inclusion. They attempt to equally provide for the specific goals of women, the LGBT community, all minorities, environmentalists, laborers, the college-educated, the minimum wage worker, the religious, the non-religious, all while balancing their own core agenda. The result being a party that is just barely held together by an animosity toward a common enemy, which is perhaps most commonly embodied by the, quote, straight white Republican man. Either of the rich variety who keeps the lower classes impoverished and halts progress for his own gain while polluting the planet, or the poor uneducated variety which enables the former. Though the Republicans are far from a homogeneous party, their core base of support does tend to be white Americans, and the majority of divisions within the party tend to be more ideological than identity-based. For this reason, there are only a few Republican successor parties, though their support base is notably larger, while the Democrats would break into many successor parties with less support. Returning to the parties, on the far left, the Socialists, the Social Democrats, and the Democratic Socialists would unite into a plainly socialist party, standing on a platform of achieving social equity between races, genders, and classes, abolishing the capitalist system to be replaced by a socialist system, promoting nuclear disarmament while withdrawing from all present conflicts, and embracing a policy of internationalism. The majority of progressives and moderate social democrats would throw their support behind the now more viable Green Party, which stands on principles of social justice, non-interventionism, environmental protection, and still a little bit of socialism. Non-socially liberal members of the working class and labor sectors would establish their own economically focused Labor Party, one which would advocate higher wages, economic protectionism, social welfare programs, protection for union workers, and a system of industrial democracy. What remains of the official Democrat Party would be a handful of progressives, liberals, and moderates. It would stand for protection of already existing civil liberties, free trade, and economic liberalism. Beyond purely ideological parties, there are also various cultures and interest groups within the Republican and Democrat parties who would now seek to and have the means with which to sustain a political party of their own. Building off a party which has existed in the past, we could easily see the emergence of a Southern or Dixiecrat faction. A modern Dixiecrat party could be expected to adopt firmly conservative positions on matters pertaining to religion, education, the Second Amendment, and the like. It would carry with it a platform of state sovereignty, that being to increase the local autonomy of individual states and communities, while opposing mandates imposed at the federal level. It's unlikely to openly support segregation as the old Dixiecrats had, though may promote the libertarian value of freedom of association, allowing businesses and communities to collectively discriminate or exclude on any criteria they wish to. The modern Dixiecrats would also believe in supporting the agrarian tradition of the South by providing special privileges and securities for farmers and landowners, as well as developing lands for agricultural use instead of urban construction. Agrarianism would not be about excluding the use of industry or technology, but simply putting greater emphasis on what it believed to be the most noble, natural, and enriching lifestyle. The party would find the majority of its support from conservative white Southerners, farmers, and conservative rural communities across the country. A political party representing the black population and its interests is almost certain to emerge as well. A congressional caucus already exists to fulfill the purpose of giving blacks a collective voice in politics, but generally finds its pro-black agenda constrained by the various other goals of the Democrat Party, with whom they are forced to cooperate but clearly don't wish to rely upon. This reflected quite well in their official motto, which states, "Black people have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests." This is a group very aware of its identity and tends to vote as a collective, some 80 to 90% of the black vote consistently going to the Democrat Party in the last 15 presidential elections. We could expect similar support for the new party, which would stand on a platform of racial equality, or rather more specifically additional opportunities and securities for black citizens. It would advocate an economic policy which ranges from liberal to socialist, promoting universal health care, increased welfare funds, free college tuition, expanded social services and public utilities, etc. Despite black alignment with the fairly liberal Democrat Party, this new party would tend to hold conservative positions on social matters outside of race relations, as blacks constitute the most religious racial group in the United States, with 94% having a strong belief in the existence of a god, and over half of blacks specifically within the Democrat Party believing religion is necessary to live a moral life. This translates into a hardline opposition to various liberal policies such as same-sex marriage. Following with this theme, a Hispanic party could be expected to play a similar role, representing a group even larger than the black population, though likely receiving less support, as Hispanics, unlike blacks, are less likely to vote as a collective unit and are far more diverse both culturally and politically. Its platform would be similar to that of the Black Party, but more moderate and willing to compromise with others given the wider range of views within the demographic. Other racial groups such as Asians and Native Americans would likely establish their own parties as well, though wouldn't have nearly as much support and probably not enough to reach national prominence. The LGBT community, though relatively small in terms of its overall population, is very politically active and finds a large amount of support from liberals and progressives, its congressional caucus having over twice as many members as the blacks and Hispanics. It's debatable whether or not it could achieve some representation at the national level, but it certainly would have a decent presence in the local and state elections, especially in liberal states and communities. Now, a women's party could also be established, however, looking over the voting trends of women, the platforms of other parties, and with minority women likely throwing the bulk of their support behind their ethnic party instead, this women's party would only be left with a small fraction of the single white Democrat female demographic to support it. This is probably enough for local and possibly state representation, but likely not federal, and support is really only likely to decline once women's issues are taken up by one of the larger left-wing factions. We'd find a similar issue with Christians, who do appear to have the overall numbers to launch a significantly sized party. However, upon closer inspection, we see much of that support is taken up by the Dixiecrats, who appeal to white Baptists, the Black Party, which appeals to Black Baptists, the Hispanic Party, which appeals to Hispanic Catholics, not to mention the remaining parties, the conservative ones especially, which could easily get by on a pro-Christian reputation, leaving a would-be Christian party with only a fragment of total Christian support. That being said, this party would likely find the most success at the local level, though it could still win minor support even at the federal level. However, its platform of promoting temperance, abstinence, and Christian values is something which works best at the community level, and possibly grows over time if it proves successful. On the matter of religion, Mormons would almost certainly establish their own party and reach state-level power with ease, as a bulk of their population is concentrated within a single state and is slowly expanding into neighboring states. Other religious groups are likely to be too small and spread out to form their own major parties. Certain large or culturally unique states such as New York, Florida, Texas, California, Hawaii, and Alaska would also establish independence parties to campaign for more state autonomy or total independence from the Union, much like Bloc Québécois in Canada or the Scottish National Party in the UK. Though these state parties are unlikely to gain significant influence in the average election, they would very likely gain popularity in times of controversy and national crisis. At the national level, things would probably seem mostly familiar. The right-wing and left-wing factions would form their own coalitions, which would generally resemble the Republican and Democrat parties as we knew them, though with each faction now proportionally represented based upon their support among the population, meaning that either coalition could come to be dominated by a new faction each election. Applying this system to the US, the leading faction of the winning coalition would typically get to appoint its party leader as the President of the United States, as we said before, changing the very way by which the president is elected. At the local level, we'd see much more of a cultural and political change, as you now have specialized parties no longer constrained by the standards of the Democrats or Republicans, and while this does come off as providing more freedoms and privileges tailored to individual communities, it may also come with a side effect of reinforcing those regional and cultural divides across the country. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you think there are any major political parties we might have missed. The US of Z thanks you for watching, support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.